Welcome to the final episode of season 1 of the FYBS Playbook, Big Feelings, Real Caregiving from Toddlers to Teens. I'm Dr. Sandy Chafulias, psychologist, researcher, and mom of 3 in their 20s. And apparently somebody who needs 8 episodes to say some of what we're going to talk about today.
And I'm Dr. Jess Kozlowski, special educator, researcher, and mom of 2 under the age of 10. We've spent the season asking caregivers to stay regulated, repair ruptures, scaffold without hovering, and refill their own tanks. Today, let's be honest about how we know this, but still fall short ourselves.
That's right. You know, season closers are sometimes pitched as highlight reels, but we're going to try not to do that. We're focusing on how we are still figuring it out, just like you. So for this episode, we're going to stick with those 3 ideas, but with a twist to try and focus more on ourselves, what the researcher has actually changed our minds about, you know, what we got wrong, even though we know the science, and really what we're still figuring out.
Great. Love that. And of course, we'll end with our 2 audience questions and 1 takeaway to feel your best self to send us off into season 2.
You ready?
Ready.
I'm ready. Okay. So for idea 1, let's start what I think is missing a lot of times from those expert forward conversations, you know, and that is what we actually changed our minds about. For me, I think the biggest shift that I've learned about is about how early coping skills and long-term emotional health are really connected. I spent years not fully grappling with or understanding those connections because, again, we think about kids in life stages. We don't think about it as the whole picture. And so with the time that we've spent building the FYBS theory of change, like how does Feel Your Best Self actually work, forced us to really sit a lot harder with that question, like what actually links early coping to that long-term functioning. You know, we always knew that we wanted to curate different strategies with Feel Your Best Self because choice is important. But I didn't really connect that to the long-term goal. And that is like, what does an emotionally healthy adult look like?
Mm-hmm.
And so through FYBS, a kid can build an identity that says, I'm someone who is capable of getting through hard things. I can try my best. And if it doesn't work, I'm capable of choosing something different.
I love that. You know, I think for me, the biggest shift is about adolescent well-being.
Okay.
My kids aren't quite there yet. So what I draw on is my own adolescence
Sure.
and then my experiences as a teacher.
Yep.
But digging into this area of research has really changed how I think about Feel Your Best Self.
Okay.
And, you know, when we started, you know, back a couple years ago now with Feel Your Best Self, we really focused on elementary ages. And really hadn't thought about it expanding to different age groups.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, now we're in high schools and middle schools doing related programming. And, you know, it's just been
an accidental good thing,
an accidental, unintended positive consequence. And so there's recently this brand new study that came out. It was a huge international project, over 6,000 adolescents across 24 countries, with the goal of mapping how well-being is organized for youth across that time frame. And the researchers found really interesting differences between early and middle adolescence. So overall for adolescents, life satisfaction and student life satisfaction are really central to their understanding. But in early adolescence, teens tend to focus on their present experiences. That's how they're deciding or evaluating their life satisfaction. But then in middle adolescence, that shift really turns towards the future and their expectations for what's to come in making those appraisals of their life satisfaction. And so that really makes me think about the situations that kids are focused on and what they're thinking about. And then how do we match recommendations for Feel Your Best Self strategies to try in those different moments?
You know, I think you started by saying that was a cross-national study. So like 24 countries, you said. And I think that matters too, because that's been unusual in the well-being literature. Most studies come from a single country or a single demographic. So that sort of research is actually a really cool way to think about adaptations for Feel Your Best Self. it was built to be flexible across ages and settings, but the strategies were still drawn from an existing literature that's very Western focused. So we definitely need to see how that flexibility gets tested for fit across cultures.
Absolutely. And so to bring idea one together, we're landing on acknowledging that research often doesn't have a single static answer. We need to use it to change how we think and what we do.
I think that's right. I think we've both held beliefs that evidence later complicated, especially when you try and put that into your own lives, right? But I think thinking about it as the process of adapting our own beliefs and thinking, that's kind of, I guess, research working, right?
That's great. Yeah. That's why we research. Keep learning. Ready for idea two?
Yep.
Okay.
What we got wrong?
What we got wrong, despite knowing the science. So, research changing your mind is one thing. Getting it wrong in practice, even when you know better, that's another.
Yep.
For me, I think I'm still working on my mindset around social emotional learning instruction in schools.
Okay.
So, the research is strong to support it. I taught it myself while I'm working in schools. Now my kids are taught it both at home and school.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there's recently been a lot of controversy about social emotional learning in schools.
Yep.
And it's really not as much about the research. Folks aren't really contesting that, there's research to support it, but instead it's about values, about autonomy and the role of schools.
Yep.
And so I'm working on being curious rather than defensive or judgmental when others express those views. Because I know the science and I know the argument, but I'm still getting that wrong sometimes.
Yep, definitely. That applies to lots of different things. And I can certainly think about a lot of similar examples from my own days as a practicing school psychologist, forgetting to pause and think about how my personal frame might be influencing how I'm interpreting or approaching a situation, an evaluation, recommendations, all those things. So for the people giving advice out there, and there are so many out there, including the two of us, we have to remember, listeners, that we're working from incomplete pictures, and we're not sure we can ever have a final or a complete picture. It is why we've purposely built Feel Your Best Self with intent to be flexible, but intent and execution aren't always the same thing. And we have to be open to embracing how people adapt to use it. I'm thinking about the example from a project that we were just wrapping up about doing some adaptations into more specifically for preschool, and the conversations from setting to setting with early childhood care providers where they allow screens, they don't allow screens. So that's maybe a simple example, but another example would be with our strategy called Shake Out the Yuck. There were some centers or staff that said, well, we don't like to use the word yuck, so we wouldn't want to use that strategy. And that never would have crossed our minds before.
Yeah. And, on the personal side, we've shared a few of our own caregiving failures across the season. And those weren't made up examples. They were
definitely real
things. And so knowing the science doesn't make us immune to the moment. The dysregulation still happens. The misfired repair still comes. And the thing you said at the end of a super depleting week will still happen.
Might have happened to me last night, as a matter of fact, or on the same day that I actually taught a class on the science behind it. Just go home and ask my own kids. There's definitely a gap between knowing something and putting in place. It's always there, especially in this messy world of caregiving. Science helps us say what's possible, but it doesn't automatically become what you can do.
That's right. That's a great wrap for idea two. We might know the science and how it can guide us, but we're still going to get things wrong. Often our message with Feel Your Best Self is to stay curious. My favorite word. Be an explorer as you recognize, reflect, and respond to big feelings. So we have to remember to do that same thing ourselves.
Yep. Be an explorer. I love how we talk about that with kids, but it's just the same for caregivers as well, when you're learning how to manage your emotions and cope with your emotions. So I think that could be a good way to transition to our final idea, or and that's really about what we're still figuring out and what comes next. So what we're exploring ourselves is really about what we're still working through for ourselves that are driving the recommendations that we're sharing with our audience here. We know effective coping matters. Through the season, we've shared evidence and stories about what happens both in the short term and the long term when we do or don't build those skills early on. And, we put together that Feel Your Best Self theory of change to show what that looks like in a picture. And when we present it to different audiences, it definitely resonates. Like people totally get it. But we don't really have a simple answer as to which of the 12 strategies that we do have now work best for which kid at what age and in what context. So we're working on those answers with our colleagues around the world to figure out how to match the problem to a recommendation for your child and situation. It's still a process. We're understanding.
Yeah, I think another piece is the systems question. We've spent a lot of this season on what caregivers can do in the moment using Feel Your Best Self to scaffold, co-regulate, and repair. And those things matter, but it can be easy to get lost in remembering that all of that happens within systems, within schools, community organizations, and families that either are going to make that easier to do or much harder. And we know that consistent language and strategies across developmental stages and settings helps kids. But how do we get everyone on the same page? I've worked in schools that had common language and relatively consistent programming across grade levels. It took a lot of work to get there, and it still wasn't perfect.
But going on to being an explorer again, too, the first part really is just acknowledging your part and your role and what small parts you can contribute to trying out and figuring it out. So definitely all very true. And why another part of our work together is about supporting the systems as they strive to be effective, to be efficient at how you support the whole child, the whole teacher, the whole family. It's so easy to slip into our own silos of expertise. But when we don't do the messy work to coordinate, to communicate, to listen, it ends up just leaving that caregiver hanging out there to figure it out by themselves. And that can be a parent, the parent, as we've talked about a lot, but it also could be in community spaces like coaches who are tasked with, managing it all and motivating athletic performance, but can't do that really well when they don't look at the whole kid. We know coaches are looking for those same supports that we're doing, and I'm grateful to be working with great colleagues around that. But the more we dive into this work around whole athletes and whole kids, the more connections I see to the Feel Your Best Self frame.
Absolutely. And I also want to go back to that cultural thread that we've had running through the episodes, how much harder it is for some caregivers whose practices don't map onto that dominant framework. The emotional labor required of constant code switching shouldn't be an afterthought, even though we don't have all the answers on how to reduce that load.
Sure. So, I think as we close up, it's a good time probably to summarize what Feel Your Best Self is and what it isn't. Feel Your Best Self is a practical framework. It's grounded in developmental science. It's for helping kids and caregivers recognize feelings, reflect on their options, and respond with an emotion coping strategy that's grounded in evidence. It's not evidence completed. It's purposely designed to be flexible to stretch. But we're still learning where the edges to that stretch should be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to wrap up idea 3. We're still figuring it out. But for us, that's not a weakness. It's what it takes to continue pushing forward, to continue learning and growing. And that's why we'll see you in season 2 to continue these conversations about what we're learning and what we're still figuring out together.
Yeah. We still have time for questions?
We do. Do it.
All right.
All right. Our first question comes from a listener who says, I've been listening all season. I'm a school counselor and I feel like I keep getting it right at work, but completely falling apart at home. How do I close that gap?
Okay. What are you going to do?
Well, that gap that you're describing is real and it makes complete sense. You spend a lot of professional energy regulating other people's kids all day long. And then you come home depleted, much like we've talked about in our episode on caregiver capacity.
Mm-hmm.
The version of you at work got better training for the job, is less tired, is less triggered, and is operating with a whole lot more role clarity. The bounds of your job in that setting. Home removes all of those supports.
Well, that's true. So maybe the goal at home shouldn't be to expect to be the same way you are at work. Maybe it's enough to bring the same orientation, the idea of curiosity and simple non-judgment and willingness to explore, that the relationship can stay strong, even when you're not executing it perfectly like you do at your job. You don't need to counsel your kids. You just need to be their parent, which is a different and harder job. And knowing the science means you could name the gap faster, but it doesn't mean that the gap won't be there. And you should, be hard on yourself for seeing that gap or not having that gap disappear.
Right. One practical suggestion, try building a small transition ritual between work and home.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about that in episode 6. 5 minutes in the car, a song, a short walk, something that tells your nervous system that work is ending for the day and now your life at home is beginning. It sounds really small, but it will make a difference.
Totally different, right? I think that was what was hard coming out of coming from the pandemic and working in places versus not having to be able to even do that transition driving home. So sure, that's part of it. And listening to your favorite song without being interrupted. Right? Okay. Last question is, what do you want caregivers to take from the season? Not the strategies, but one overarching message. Okay. For me, it's going to be that you don't have to have it figured out. That's where we came to in the beginning of this episode. You don't have to be the caregiver who never loses it, never overhelps, never misses the cue that your kid is giving. What you do have to do is stay in it, stay curious and stay something and try something and be okay with repairing when it goes wrong. That accumulation, not just a single perfect moment, is what FYBS is building toward. And that's what your kids carry forward.
Absolutely. For me, I think it's the relational piece.
Okay.
The FYBS strategies matter. The science matters. But what kids remember is whether someone kept showing up, even imperfectly, after hard weeks, after ruptures, not fully repaired. Being present is the intervention. Everything else, the toolkit, the framework, the 12 strategies, they help to facilitate that. But your presence is what is most important.
That is totally true. I think that's a good wrap on our questions. And I just, again, want to invite our audience to submit those questions so we're ready for season 2. You can go to feelyourbestself.org or wherever you see us on social media to reach out and let us know what you're thinking about as a caregiver. I think we should wrap up with the one takeaway to feel your best self. What do you think?
Let's do it.
All right. So let's make it a season takeaway, not just an episode takeaway. I think it's like picking one thing that you use to think about or do something differently. And for me, I always come back to that one FYBS strategy you try. Like the one time you caught that big feeling before it became bigger, right? And for me, it's oftentimes is a turn the dial thing, like a shifting your perspective. Like maybe the person didn't mean to cut me off or whatever that might be. Something small or something little. That's not nothing. That's a big deal. And so I invite our listeners and myself to try it again, to build that small habit, small stuff.
Great. Love that. And for me, I'd like to give a shout out to any caregiver who has felt like we're describing someone else's situation.
Interesting.
Our goal is that you find some way that it connects to yours, but maybe starting from a different point or with different specifics. And so we built the FYBS playbook for you and the need to feel seen in whatever caregiving role you hold and to be able to find ways to cope yourself. So Feel Your Best Self was built for families with input from lots of caregivers along the way, and we're still building it. And would love to hear your suggestions.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. So I think closing it up, as we look back on season 1, we have had a great time leaning in together into what big feelings look like at different ages. As educators and moms, we have gotten some of it right, but we're still working on the rest, just like you, our listeners.
That means we still have lots to explore when it comes to real caregiving across ages and all of the places where kids look for caregiving. We'll see you next time
on the FYBS Playbook.
Every day you feel a million things, but I promise that it all will be okay. I'll think of you and what you do, you will find your way. Feel your best self.